With the reception of the last Cyberpunk video being relatively positive, I think it's appropriate to test another popular and demanding title, Helldivers 2. Let's put this system to the test and see if it's worth playing this game on a budget gaming computer. Before we get into this video, I'd like to say not to forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Additionally, don't forget to leave a comment, especially if there's something I missed. I can't cover every aspect of an entire computer and piece of software in the relatively short duration of a video. I more so wanted to recap the specs of the system, then dive into Helldivers 2 performance. I also wanted to say that when I went to edit this video, I found that all the Helldivers 2 footage that I recorded on the budget PC is corrupt, even though I played it back almost immediately after recording it. As a result, all the footage you'll be seeing is just off my main desktop with the graphics settings cranked, so it isn't super representative of what the game looks like on the budget build. Without anything else to say, let's dive into what's powering this PC. With the heart of this build being the $78 Intel Core i3-12100, we've got 4 relatively powerful cores to power the Intel Arc A750 as the graphics power for this machine. With 16 gigs of 3200 megatransfer per second DDR4 and a 500 gig Samsung 970 EVO, we've got plenty of fast memory and storage to load and store games to and from. And while the capacity of this Gen 3 NVMe drive is kind of restrictive, for running a few games at a time, it's plenty and is fast enough to significantly speed up load times. With an MSI Mag B760 Tomahawk Wi-Fi, we've got a very strong backbone for the system that will leave plenty of room to upgrade later down the line once parts get cheaper. A $40 PowerSpec PSU is powering the entire system, and while I wouldn't necessarily trust it to run my 14700K and 4070, it'll be fine for the sub 300 watts this build draws under load. All the specs of this machine are in the description, and for just under $500 USD, it's pretty hard to beat for a CPU with strong single-threaded performance and a powerful 17 teraflop GPU. With the specs out of the way, let's dive into the gameplay, and see how this build handles Helldivers 2. Diving into the lowest settings, and the budget PC can play this title well at all resolutions tested. Surprisingly, even at 4K, things didn't feel like they were too bogged down due to the performance. With an average and 1% low of 55 and 39 FPS at 2160p, it's very playable but isn't as smooth as 1440p. When turning the resolution down, the average came up to 84 while the 1% low hung around 39 FPS. 1080p saw the best performance on average, with the i3 and A750 combo returning 112 FPS. The 1% lows were still kind of low, down at 42, but while you're playing the game you don't really notice these dips, so it's hard to say that it's a deal breaker. Just to see how many FPS the i3 can push, I retested it the same preset, but this time with the upscaling slider set to performance. This is probably FSR 1.0 just based on how blurry the image is, but unlike Cyberpunk 2077, it actually helps performance quite a bit both on average and the 1% lows. With an average and 1% low of 133 and 51 FPS at 1080p, things were beyond playable and also kinda blurry. 1440p saw a slight improvement to the blurriness, while retaining an average and 1% low of 120 and 41 FPS respectively. In this case, the upscaling didn't seem to do that much to help the 1% lows, but the average performance improved significantly. 4K saw another large jump on average, with the system returning 90 FPS, but the 1% lows weren't improved by much, coming in at 40. I think that the upscaling tech that this game uses works well for improving the average and maximum performance, but doesn't help as much with the 1% lows, possibly due to a CPU bottleneck. To investigate further, I next ran the game at the Ultra preset, with no upscaling to get a baseline as to how the game performs in a worst case scenario. To my surprise, things were playable at 1080p but not optimal, with an average and 1% low of 57 and 25 FPS respectively. 1440p saw the average dip down to 45 and the 1% low came in at 21, once again remaining playable, but it's definitely less enjoyable than at 1080p. 4K was completely unplayable at these settings, returning an average of 26 and a 1% low of 15, so the upscaling tech has a lot of work to do here. Turning said tech onto the quality setting, but the 1% low saw margin of error improvements. Achieving an average and 1% low of 67 and 28 FPS at 1080p, we're above 60 FPS on average, which is a nice improvement, but there were still times where things hitched quite significantly. 1440p saw another nice improvement on average, coming in at 57, but the 1% lows were still a bit below where things felt smooth 100% of the time, coming in at 24. 4K saw probably the largest improvement in terms of raw percentages, with the average and 1% lows coming in at 40 and 20 FPS respectively. Upscaling seems to improve performance on average here as well, with the 1% lows not being affected as much, like what we saw with the lowest settings. Upscaling seems like it's worth using at the quality setting at resolutions above 1080p, and might even be worth utilizing at the lower 1080p, but it gets pretty blurry at the lower upscaling settings, and especially at resolutions lower than 1440p. It's definitely a nice to have, but if you're not super aggressive with your settings, you won't need it at 1080p and probably even 1440p. Moving away from upscaling, and I wanted to see how the system performs at a middle ground in terms of graphics settings. At the medium preset, things perform significantly worse than at the low and lowest settings, making me question which specific setting is the one that impacts performance the most. Achieving an average and 1% low of 61 and 22 FPS at 1080p, the performance on offer is lower than our lowest settings test, but slightly higher than the ultra settings test. 1440p saw the average and 1% low drop down to 48 and 20 FPS respectively, once again being better than the performance at ultra settings, but not 100% optimal for most users. Upscaling might be worth investigating at this resolution and also at 4K, as the per pixel computational load for this game seems quite high once you turn some settings up. 4K remains sort of playable, but it's definitely substandard for a lot of PC players, with its 37 FPS average and 27 FPS 1% low. The lower end of the performance spectrum has improved with the jump to 4K, but in total it's not really worth turning the resolution up past 1080p if you're looking for the smoothest gameplay. If you want to play Helldivers on a configuration like this, be aware that turning up the settings does increase the computational load on your system quite dramatically at and beyond the medium settings. At the lower end of the setting spectrum, things ultimately perform pretty well at all resolutions, and remains playable even at 4K. Turn on upscaling at the lowest settings, and you'll get some incredible performance at 1080 and 1440p, with the game feeling super smooth and responsive. Even 4K saw some decent performance at these settings, and although this is at the lowest settings, the upscaling isn't as noticeable since the resolution is higher. The game doesn't look that blurry, and it's pretty enjoyable, which is surprising considering this is a $500 PC. Beyond the lowest and medium settings, only 1080p is really playable without upscaling, with 1440p becoming more playable with it enabled, and 4K remaining relatively unplayable thanks to dips in performance at times, even with upscaling enabled. Ultra settings are probably off the table at all resolutions, simply because even with upscaling, the 1% lows remain so poor that it just feels inconsistent to the point where I'd rather play at the lower settings. This is strange as the GPU is significantly more powerful than the CPU, meaning we should be able to push resolution a lot further than we are in this title. This makes me think that there's some sort of CPU bottleneck, as performance with the same GPU and an i5-13600K looks significantly better than what's on offer here. This makes me think that recommending at least an i5-12400 for this particular title at higher settings is a must, but you can definitely get by with an i3 as long as you're fine with lower quality graphical effects. So thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, and click the bell icon so you'll be notified about all our future uploads. Let me know what you guys think about how this build performed. Unfortunately, there isn't a ton to say, because beyond the low settings, things didn't look 100% consistent. I'd probably stick to said low settings if I were gaming on a build of this power level, but the fact that you can customize it is a testament to the power of the PC platform. That's all I really have to say on the matter. So thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.